My name is Ava Collins, and I never knew that one small act of kindness on a freezing winter night would unravel every lie hidden beneath the polished world of the wealthy. I was just trying to help an old man in a blizzard, but that moment led me to uncover betrayal, corruption, and a truth that had been buried literally. I faced humiliation, heartbreak, and danger. Yet I learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply revealing the truth. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Snow hammered the streets of Denver that night, turning Colfax Avenue into a sheet of white noise and swirling frost. Even the streetlights seemed tired, casting shaky cones of pale light over sidewalks buried in drifts. The city buses crawled forward like worn-out animals, their engines groaning, their windows fogged from the breath of exhausted passengers. I sat among them, clutching my small purse as though it might hold together the last pieces of my composure. My name is Ava Collins, and at that moment, I was already late for a dinner I'd spent 3 weeks preparing myself to face. A dinner with the parents of my fiancé, Ethan Hale, or rather, with his mother, Margaret Hale, the type of woman whose smile could slice marble and whose eyes scanned people the way jewelers examine gems, checking for flaws long before acknowledging worth. She believed waitresses belonged behind counters, not beside her son. And I was a waitress. My hands trembled, not from the cold, though the blizzard outside could have frozen bone, but from the thought of disappointing Ethan, of confirming the quiet suspicion that I wasn't enough for the life he belonged to. I had spent my entire paycheck on a simple blue dress, borrowed heels from a coworker, pinned my hair carefully, and even learned the names of wine varietals so I wouldn't embarrass him. But the storm had turned the city inside out. The bus jerked to a stop near Civic Center. The doors opened with a hiss, and an elderly man stepped in. His coat was thin, too thin, as though he had gone out expecting autumn and mistakenly found himself in winter. His hands shook as he reached into his pockets. I know I have it, he murmured, his voice fragile at the edges, like paper worn soft from being folded too many times. His fingers scraped through empty lining. The driver's tone cut the air. No fare, no ride, sir. You'll need to step off. Passengers turned toward the windows, their silence thick, their faces stiff with practiced indifference. No one wanted to be part of this moment. I hesitated only a second. Then I reached into my purse, withdrawing a few wrinkled bills, money I barely had to spare. I've got it, I said quietly as I walked toward the front. The driver looked irritated. Miss, you don't need. I said I've got it. My voice surprised even me, steady, final. I handed him the fare and turned to the old man, offering a gentle smile. Please sit. It's brutal out there. His eyes glistened like he hadn't seen kindness in a while. Thank you, he whispered. My name is Samuel Brooks. Ava, I replied. Please warm up a bit. But just a few minutes later, his hand went to his chest. His breath faltered. His face drained of all color. Sir, Mr. Brooks? I dropped to my knees beside him before I even realized I had moved. His hand shook violently as he tried to open his coat pocket. Medicine, he gasped. I found a bottle of nitroglycerin, twisted off the cap with numb fingers, and guided a pill beneath his tongue. The driver was shouting for an ambulance, but Samuel's grip tightened around my wrist. No, just need to get home, he rasped. Something in his voice, fear and exhaustion layered together, made the choice for me. When the bus reached the next stop, I helped him off into the blinding white of the blizzard. The wind sliced across my face like shards of ice. Snow clung to our coats, our hair, our eyelashes. I wrapped my scarf around his neck and held his arm firmly as we walked. His small apartment was only a few blocks away, but every step felt like pushing through a storm determined to swallow us. Inside, the heat sputtered weakly and the lights flickered. I made him tea with trembling fingers, the kettle rattling faintly on the stove. When his breathing finally steadied, he looked at me with something beyond gratitude, something like bewildered hope. "Why did you help me?" he asked softly. I shrugged, though my voice was barely a whisper. "Because someone should have." He nodded, eyes misting. Kindness like that is rare now. I didn't know it then. Not yet. But that single act, in a snowstorm that felt like the world shutting down, would unspool my entire life and stitch it back together into something I never could have imagined. By the time I reached the Silver Willow restaurant, nearly an hour had passed since the reservation. The blizzard had soaked through my coat and melted my carefully pinned curls into limp strands that hugged my cheeks. My makeup, hours of effort, had softened into faint, tired smudges. The restaurant was all warm gold light, quiet jazz, and crystal glassware. It was the kind of place where wealth didn't show itself loudly. It simply existed like oxygen. At the table near the window sat Ethan and his family. Margaret Hale was the first to notice me. Her smile was a blade. "Oh, Ava," she sighed, lifting her wine glass delicately. The storm must have been dreadful, though one would think proper planning might have prevented such disarray. The other diners at the table, elegantly dressed, effortless in their belonging, allowed themselves polite little smiles. I murmured an apology and sat beside Ethan. He didn't look at me. I felt like a stain on the tablecloth. Champagne was poured. Conversations resumed. Stocks, lake houses, charity galas. I tried to follow along, but every word made me feel smaller, like I was slowly folding inward. Then the oysters arrived, gleaming, pale, and unfamiliar. "Ava," Margaret said sweetly, "you do eat oysters, don't you?" I hesitated, searching for the tiny fork. "I've never actually." Laughter broke like glass. "Oh, how charming," Margaret purred. "Ethan, your fiancé is full of surprises." Heat flashed up my neck. My heart ached so sharply it felt physical. And still, Ethan said nothing. Not a word. Not a glance. Nothing. I excused myself quietly and stood. Ethan finally looked up, startled. "Ava, where are you going?" "Home," I said. My voice didn't shake this time. Outside, the storm swallowed the sound of my steps. The snow, at least, did not judge me. The wind clawed at my face as soon as I stepped outside the Silver Willow. The restaurant's golden glow faded behind me, swallowed whole by the storm. Snowflakes stung my cheeks, sharp and wet. I didn't bother to wipe them away. I didn't care if someone inside saw me cry. And I didn't care whether Ethan ran after me, because somewhere between the laughter at that table and the silence that came from the person who was supposed to love me, something inside me had finally snapped. Not broken. Snapped clean. The sidewalks were empty, the city wrapped in white fury. I walked anyway, my borrowed heels slipping, my coat too thin to guard me from the cold that settled under my skin. Cars crawled by in slow motion. Street lights flickered like dying candles. I kept walking, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean feeling, and I was afraid of what might happen if I let myself feel fully what had just happened. By the time I reached my apartment, I was shaking. I peeled off my wet coat and shoes, leaving them in a small puddle by the door. The radiator hummed unevenly in the living room, growing louder whenever the building heat flickered on, as though it were trying to reassure the tenants that warmth was still possible. My mother, Ruth, sat in her usual spot on the sofa, shawl around her shoulders, oxygen tubing looped gently over her ears. Her eyes lifted as soon as I entered, noticing the storm clinging to me, noticing everything. "Ava," she murmured, her voice soft and lined with concern, "you're soaked through. Come here, darling." I sat beside her, but instead of unburdening myself slowly, gracefully, as I'd imagined practicing in the bathroom mirror earlier that day, My composure cracked wide open. I told her everything. Not just the dinner, but the months leading up to it. The quiet comments. The feeling of being silently measured and found lacking. The way Ethan always asked me to be patient, as if one day his mother would simply wake up and decide I was worthy of breathing her air. The part one couldn't say aloud was louder than all the rest. I had tried so hard to belong to a world that was never made for me. Ruth didn't interrupt. She listened with the patience of someone who had been broken before and learned how to gather themselves back piece by piece. When I finished, when my voice finally gave out, she took my cold hands in hers. "You don't need to earn love," she whispered. "Not from me, not from him, not from anyone." And although her voice was soft, the truth in it hit with force. I leaned my head against her shoulder. She smelled like chamomile tea and clean laundry and the quiet kind of strength that lives in people who kept going even when life refused to be gentle. But that night, while I slept curled beside her, the cold I had walked in finally took root. By morning, my skin burned with fever. The room spun when I tried to stand. My mother moved slower these days. Her heart couldn't keep up with fast steps, but she helped cool my forehead and whispered prayers under her breath. Her own chest rose and fell with effort. Outside, the storm softened. The world became deceptively quiet. My phone buzzed so many times that day that I eventually shoved it into a drawer. Ethan called, texted, called again. I stared at his name, blinking on the screen, waiting for the guilt to return. It didn't. By the second day, I turned the phone off completely. The engagement ring sat on my dresser. I didn't touch it. When I was finally well enough to get up again, my mother was the one who needed help. Her breathing had become more strained. Her color was wrong, too pale, too tired. So I wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and drove her carefully through roads still lined with snowbanks taller than street signs. St. Joseph Medical Center was warm, loud with footsteps and rolling carts and the soft murmur of nurses. The cardiology ward always smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and brewed coffee, the kind of mix that feels like hope and exhaustion blended together. After my mother was taken to the examination room, I sat in the waiting area, rubbing my hands to warm them. The fluorescent lights made everything look washed out. I let my mind drift somewhere quiet. That was when I saw him, Samuel. He sat alone near the coffee cart, his coat folded neatly beside him, his hat in his lap. He looked up slowly, and when recognition lit his face, it did so gently, like sunrise, not shock. "Well," he said with a tired smile, "if it isn't the young woman who saved me from freezing to death in a blizzard." I laughed before I realized I had. I joined him. We spoke easily, the way people speak who recognize something familiar in one another, even if they can't yet name it. He asked about my mother. I told him her heart was failing faster than we wanted to admit. He nodded, his expression shifting into something soft and deeply understanding. "I used to come here with my son," he murmured, "before the accident." His voice didn't break. It just thinned, like thread stretched too far. He told me about Mark, how he built a real estate firm from nothing, how he had laughed easily and trusted deeply, how he had been killed in what police called a robbery, how the world had continued turning even when Samuel's had not. "People keep telling me time heals," he said quietly, "but time only teaches you how to live with the whole." I didn't speak. Some pains do not need answering. They only need witnessing. From that day forward, I visited Samuel whenever my mother had appointments. Sometimes even when she didn't. We sat in the cafeteria with cheap coffee and plastic plants, talking about things that didn't hurt for once. Books, childhood memories, his late wife's garden, the way the city looked just after snowfall. And slowly, steadily, grief began to shift, not disappear, but soften enough to leave room for warmth. Then, one morning, Samuel asked if I would come with him to Fairmont Cemetery, just to place flowers for his son. The sky was pale, the air cold, but still. Snow clung to tree branches in delicate, glittering layers. Samuel walked slowly, leaning on my arm. We stopped beside a small granite headstone carved with Mark Brooks. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with love. Snow never bothered him, Samuel whispered. He used to shovel the whole neighborhood just to help people. I called him my winter soldier. His voice wavered. I knelt beside him, smoothing the snow from the stone. Then we heard footsteps, slow, crunching softly through the frost. We turned. A man stood a few yards away, coat dusted white, hood low, breath-forming ghosts in the air. He stopped, as though afraid to come closer. His voice was quiet, raw. Dad. Samuel froze. Completely. His body went slack, and for a moment I thought he might fall. The man lifted his hood. The same eyes. The same jaw. The same grief. Not a memory. Not a ghost. But living. Breathing. Scarred. Older. It's me, he whispered. It's Mark. Samuel collapsed to his knees, sobbing into trembling hands. Flowers spilled into the snow. I reached for him, but the man, Mark, was already there, catching his father, holding him tightly, whispering against his hair. I'm here. I'm alive. I'm here. Snow drifted around us like the world had stopped to listen. When Samuel could finally breathe again, he touched his son's face with shaking fingers, like he needed to confirm he was real. You died. I buried you. No, Mark said softly. You buried what they left for you to find. His voice was low, cold, controlled. There was something inside it that made the air feel sharper. Something like danger. Something like truth. We need to talk, he said, because the man who tried to kill me is still alive. And that was the moment I first heard the name. Richard Hale, Ethan's father. We took Samuel home first. He moved like a man learning his body again, each motion careful, reverent, as if he might wake from a dream and find snow where his son had been. Inside his apartment, the radiator ticked, and the tea kettle hissed, and everything ordinary felt holy. Mark stood in the doorway, breathing like he had forgotten how to take a full breath. Up close, I saw the thin white line of a scar along his jaw. The older scars vanished into his hairline, the careful way he scanned corners as if danger still lurked there. He apologized. I told him he didn't have to. Samuel sat in his chair clutching the mug with both hands, his eyes going from his son to the steam and back again, as if memorizing proof. Mark didn't speak until the kettle quieted, until the apartment had the stillness of a stage just before the curtain rises. He told us about a meeting 2 winters ago he should never have attended, about a promise of a last-minute investor, a remote road, headlights, a muzzle flash, about waking to fire, choking smoke, the weight of twisted metal, the taste of blood, crawling the way a wounded animal crawls, refusing to die because the thought of his father alone felt worse than pain. A ranger had found him, he said, a stranger with kind hands and a duty to remain invisible in a world that punishes witnesses. He hid Mark in a cabin through the winter, then in motels under false names while Mark learned to walk without grimacing and think without rage. When the rage settled into focus, he began collecting what mattered. Emails Richard Hale had sent from a private account he thought no one could find. Voicemails left on a burner phone to a man later killed in a robbery a shell company used to siphon funds from clients who would never know why their projects failed. The death certificate, I asked, and Mark's mouth curved with a griefless smile. A coroner who owed him a favor, he said. A body burned past recognition. A ring stolen from my gym bag and slipped onto a dead man's finger. Samuel made a sound that was almost a growl. He gripped the armrests like he needed to hold onto something solid. "We go to the police," he said. "Tonight." Mark shook his head. "We go where evidence can't disappear in a drawer," he replied. "We go to people who are watched by other people who are watched by cameras." His eyes flicked to me, then, assessing, not cold but practical. "Do you trust anyone?" he asked. The question surprised me. I thought of nurses who slipped my mother warm blankets and of a young doctor who had explained the cardiology plan without condescension. But the person I trusted most was sitting across from me with a scar and a name that could burn a city. "I trust the truth," I said finally, "and I trust the part of me that's tired of being quiet." The plan formed without calling itself a plan. I went to my mother first because you don't build anything that matters on a lie at home. She listened with her hands folded and that steady way she has of meeting storms with breath. If a man wanted the world to believe a good son was dead, she said, then bringing the truth into light is not revenge, it's repair. She touched my cheek. "But be careful, Ava. The powerful can afford patience, and they can afford ruin." I kissed her forehead, breathed in the laundry-soft scent of her, and promised I would move like a person who knew both those facts. I called Ethan, not because I wanted to hear his voice, but because the next part needed his mother's attention, and the quickest way to Margaret Hale is through the son she'd polished into a weapon. He answered on the second ring, too quickly, as if guilt had been coiled in his throat waiting for the chance to be released. He began with an apology that sounded like a speech. I let him spend it, then interrupted quietly. "I'm returning the ring tomorrow," I said. "I'll drop it at your office." Silence clicked on the line. "Ava, please." "Also," I added, and in my own voice I heard something new and unflinching. "Your father's charity gala at the Silver Willow on Friday. Be there." He exhaled. "Why?" "Because I want you to see what real silence looks like," I said, and hung up. The days between stretched taut with logistics. Mark assembled his files on my kitchen table. Printed emails, photographs of ledger entries, screenshots backed up to hard drives I hid in places no one would consider twice, inside flower canisters beneath the lining of an old suitcase taped behind the vent in the hallway. Samuel wrote down names he remembered from past dinners with Richard, men who had slapped his back and called him Sam, and told him what a tragedy it was that success can't protect a boy on a bad night. I ordered a cheap voice recorder and tested it until I could start it with a touch at my wrist. I met a local journalist in the hospital cafe where I'd met Samuel, choosing a table within clear view of 3 cameras. I told her enough to make her sit straighter, to make her promise a photographer would be at the gala. "You're accusing a very protected man," she warned. "I'm placing the truth where protection is weaker," I said, "in public." Friday came thin with cold, the snow piled into gray banks, and the sky threatening more. I wore the blue dress again because I decided the dress would not be a memory of humiliation. It would be a uniform for reclamation. I wrapped my mother's shawl around my shoulders and tucked the recorder under its fringe. When I arrived at the Silver Willow, the same gold light burned through tall windows, and a parade of black coats shimmered, where the maitre d's smile separated donors from devotees. The walls were lined with photographs of hospitals and scholarship recipients. Richard Hale loved to be generous where cameras could find him. He stood near the bar, the anchor of every conversation, his grin calibrated to inspire checks with extra zeros. Margaret hovered at his right, hard diamonds catching the light, watchful in the way of people who fear dust more than collapse. Ethan reached me first. He looked relieved and angry, the way decent men do when they realize decency requires courage they haven't yet practiced. "Ava, not tonight," I said. "Listen instead." Then Margaret. "You came," she said, like a victor praising a survivor. Don't be cruel, I replied, smiling with my mouth. Her eyes sharpened. Somewhere in them a ledger updated my total. Samuel entered with Mark 10 minutes later. Time actually bent. People stared the way people stare when the world rearranges itself in a room and everyone has to pretend to keep holding a glass. Mark's hood was down. His scar was visible. The hush that fell was not reverence. It was calculation. Richard turned and saw him, and for a moment the mask malfunctioned. It was almost beautiful, the microsecond of naked surprise, the math misfiring behind his eyes. Then he recovered and performed shock the way great actors perform grief. Mark, he said too heartily, what on earth? He stopped because Mark had stopped in front of him, and Samuel was close enough to hear the first lie take breath. Tell my father you're glad I'm alive, Mark said softly, and then tell him why you tried to make him bury me. People did what crowds do. They held still to taste the moment. I stepped near the stage and signaled the sound tech with the smallest lift of my hand. The journalist raised her camera. Somewhere behind clinking glass, the recorder hummed awake. Richard laughed. A perfect, rehearsed, I'm in control laugh. This is absurd. He signaled for security. Before you do that, I said, moving toward the center of the room as if I, not he, had been invited to welcome donors. Let's all listen to the voice of a man who believed no one would ever hear him except a hired gun and the body he thought would take a name not his into the ground. The projector screen behind the bar flickered to life. I had bribed a bartender to switch inputs at exactly this minute and texted the journalist a short video clip.